Ian here with Touratech USA, coming to you today from our showroom in downtown Seattle, and we're going to be talking about our progressive spring kits for the KTM 790 and 790 Adventure R. These kits come in two main flavors. You've got your standard height progressive spring kit, which just replaces the stock springs and fork oil to give you a little bit better ride all around, especially for guys who are a little heavier. And the one that we sell the most of, that's the most popular by far, is actually our lowering kits. And the way those lowering kits work is you have a progressively wound spring that has a very soft portion at the top of the spring. And what that does is it allows the motorcycle to sag down a set amount as soon as the weight of the bike is taken off of the kickstand. And that lowers the ride of the motorcycle without making any significant internal modifications to your suspension. What that means for you is that it's absolutely the cheapest and easiest way to get your motorcycle lower to the ground. And these lowering kits that we have for the 790 and 790 Adventure R will lower both of the bikes 30 millimeters respectively from their full height, from their factory height. So let's break down what comes in these kits. Over here we have a rear shock spring. Right here we have two fork springs, and you'll notice that both of these units are progressively wound. You see the coils are tighter together at the top here. Same thing with the fork spring, tighter together at the top. Over here we've got your fork oil. The 790 Adventure R kit comes with a 7.5 weight fork oil. And then here in the middle we've got a manual. This is a generic manual, but the important part is on the back here. This sticker has a lot of critical setup information that's going to help you get the bike dialed in perfectly with the installation of the new kit. So today we're going to go through what it takes to install this suspension system into a KTM 790 Adventure R. The installation is exactly the same if you're installing the lowered version or the standard height version. So let's get into it. To complete this installation, you'll need a good set of metric sockets, Torx driver set, 24mm spanner wrench, a 50mm fork cap wrench, 32mm socket, a 14mm Allen drive tool, side cutters for zip ties, thread locker, a tool for setting the air gap in the forks, and you'll also need a spring compressor to do the rear shock spring. To get started, we need to get the bike up on a lift, and then we can get to work. So we're going to do the rear shock first. I've already got it out of the bike here, but the way we pulled it out, first thing to do is pull the exhaust off. There's a bolt up at the top of the exhaust and then a clamp right down at the bottom where it meets the catalytic converter. Once you get the exhaust can off, you're going to pull out the plug here at the upper shock mount. You're going to take out the upper shock bolt and then come down here on the swing arm, take out the lower shock bolt. Both of those are done with a 13mm socket. And then once you've got that done, you're going to run around to the other side of the motorcycle, and on the 790, the lower shock mount has a threaded bushing on it that you use a big 14mm hex driver, and it's got a reverse thread. So you're going to turn that clockwise. It takes about a turn, half a turn, and then that's going to release the tension on the lower shock mount. Then you go up to the upper shock mount, and again on the throttle side of the motorcycle, there are two bolts that you access that you have to loosen both of them about a turn and a half, and what that does is it relieves the pinch at the top of the frame, and then the shock's going to drop right out of there. Once you've got the shock loose in the frame, I came around and I removed one small bolt right here that's holding the clutch cable in, just to get a little bit more wiggle on the clutch cable, as well as I cut two of the zip ties holding this wire loom to the inside of the frame. That way I could get enough clearance to get the shock to drop out of that cradle. With the exhaust out of the way and everything loosened up, now you can just walk the shock right out of the back of the bike on the exhaust side. Don't even need to remove the rear tire. Last thing to do before we head to the spring compressor is remove this shock guard. It's held on with one bolt right here, and then it's a friction fit, so you have to pull it up over the top. Now that we have the new spring installed, we got to put the shock guard back on and then throw this back onto the bike. All right, the rear end is complete, so now it's time to move up to the front. We're going to start by taking the front wheel off, and then we'll go through in detail how to get the forks out of the bike. Okay, we got the front wheel out, but before we can remove the forks from the triple clamps, we need to remove the brake calipers, we need to remove the brake hose clamp, and on the clutch lever side of the motorcycle, we need to remove the wheel speed sensor. So it's a T30 bit for the speed sensor and the clamp, and it's a T45 for the brake caliper bolts. The only thing left holding the fork on the motorcycle at this point are the pinch bolts at the upper triple clamp and the lower triple clamp here. Before we remove the fork, if you do not have a bench vise with soft jaws on it to clamp the fork in, I highly recommend loosening the fork cap before you pull the forks off the bike. So to do that, we're going to loosen the upper pinch bolts only, loosen the fork cap. You do not need to remove this fork cap all the way right now. You just need to loosen it up so that you can do it a lot easier when you're holding the fork by hand later on. Both the 790R and the standard 790 use a 50mm wrench to loosen the upper fork cap. And then loosen the lower pinch bolts and just slide the fork leg out. So now we have both forks off the bike. We're over here in the workshop to drain oil. First thing you want to do is make sure there's no big chunks of dirt on the leg of the fork itself so we don't introduce any dirt inside. And then you're going to make sure that the preload adjuster and the damping adjuster are both backed all the way out, so turned fully counterclockwise. Also, with these forks, I highly recommend working on one fork leg at a time because the fork caps will fit on either leg, but the one leg adjusts compression and the other adjusts rebound. You don't want to get that mixed up because it'll cause you problems down the line. So now that we got everything backed out, we're going to loosen the fork cap and then let the fork stanchion slide down. Now you need to remove the fork cap, and in order to do that, you're going to need to get a 24mm wrench on the bottom nut here that's backed up against the fork cap. So you got to pull down on the spring and get the wrench slid in there while everything's compressed. Now you take your 50mm fork cap wrench, put it on the top, and turn the fork cap counterclockwise, and then you can spin it all the way off by hand. With the fork cap off, the damping rod slides down into the fork. So now we just pull the spring out and then dump the oil into our container over here. Now we're ready to refill with the new oil that was included with your progressive spring kit. So I like to fill it right up to the base of the threads in the fork tube here. And then we're going to cycle the damping rod a bunch of times and the fork tube itself to make sure that the oil works its way through all the circuits and gets most of the air bubbles out. Now that we've got all the air bubbles bled out of the fork, we need to reference the instruction booklet and see what our oil level or our air gap needs to be set to. So for this particular setup, we're going to put it at 140mm. I'm going to use this tool here, but you can replicate something like this at home with just a piece of tubing that you measure a distance and then draw a line on. But we're going to set this to 140mm where it rests at the top of the fork tube. And we're going to make sure that the fork is all the way compressed and the damping rod's all the way pushed in. And then we drop this tool in there to the set depth and then suck out all the extra oil on top. We've got the fork oil level set properly, so all we need to do now is drop the new spring in. You'll notice that the tighter progressive wind is up at the top. You want to make sure that it's always that way when you install it. Once you've gotten the fork cap engaged on the threads at the top of the damping rod, you're going to put your 24mm wrench back on that nut and then turn the fork cap in until the nut bottoms out against the underside of the fork cap. We've got the fork cap hand tight into the fork now, so this fork's almost ready to go. We just need to reference our handy sticker here and look and see what it says we're meant to have this all set to. So spring preload is meant for position 1, so that's at +0. And this is the compression leg, so compression adjustment should be 15 clicks open. So that means we're going to turn it all the way to full closed and then go out 15 clicks. Once that's done, this fork leg is ready to go back on the bike, and we just need to remember to torque the cap down when we have it back into the triple clamps. Now that we've done that compression leg, it's time to move on to the rebound leg. Process is exactly the same, so just make sure you back the adjusters all the way out before you take the cap off the fork. Now that the springs are installed and the fresh oil's in there, these forks are ready to go back onto the motorcycle. If you forget which side goes to which, you can always remember that the rebound adjuster side with the red knob goes on the right-hand throttle side of the motorcycle. The other way to remember is the compression leg, the left-hand side leg, is the one that has the threaded hole for the speed sensor on it. So not much to it, we're just going to slide these back up through the triple clamps, tighten down the lower clamp, and then tighten the fork caps before we finish the installation. At the top of the fork legs, there are these little machined in grooves. Those are so that you can set the height of the fork to adjust how the bike handles and make sure that you have it exactly the same on both sides. So I'm going to be installing these so that the second groove, the middle one there, is just showing at the top of the triple clamp. The torque for these lower triple clamp pinch bolts is surprisingly low for most folks. It's about 9 foot-pounds, and at the top it's about 10 or 11 foot-pounds. So you also have to remember that these two bolts work together, so I like to tighten them about a half turn each and just alternate back and forth until you get to the right place. All right, we're only going to torque the bottom triple clamp right now so that we can tighten down the fork cap with our 50mm wrench. We've tightened the lower triple clamps, and we've tightened the fork caps, so now we need to tighten the upper triple clamp bolts. Again, 10 or 11 foot-pounds on those guys. And that's it. Now you know what it takes to install a Touratech progressive suspension kit on your KTM 790 or 790 Adventure R. Now that you've got the suspension installed, your bike will be lower to the ground if you've installed a lowering kit, or it'll be same height but a little bit better suspension performance than stock. If you want to learn more about what parts we make for a KTM 790 or other adventure motorcycles, visit our website, touratech-usa.com. And if you like what you see in this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to see when we release more videos just like this in the future.